Konnichiwa, AP Huggers. This is Mr. Dixon with Key Issues 10.4. Today we're going to be thinking spatially about agriculture. Specifically, we're going to be reviewing von Thunen's model and spatial association, which is the study of change and continuity across space. Before we get to the fun stuff, let's get the boring stuff out of the way, or what I like to call bad jokes. What new crop did the farmer plant? Beats me. What did the baby corn say to the mama corn? Where's Pop? What is a sheep's favorite game? You think you know this one? What is a sheep's favorite game? Badminton. Why did the cabbage win the race? Because it was ahead at the end. What is a scarecrow's favorite fruit? Strawberries. This is one of my favorite ones today. What do you call a grumpy cow? Moody. And here's one that's not just a one-liner. Farmer Giles is so interested in conserving energy, he built a pig-powered car. He has to get rid of it, though. Every time he turns a corner, the tires squeal. I know you loved it. I'll keep them coming. Next time, guys, there will be twice as many. On to the material. Like I said, we're going to be talking primarily about von Thunen and issues related to von Thunen's model. So we'll talk about the understandings or the assumptions that you have to make when analyzing von Thunen's model in class, but I wanted to just give an overview for now. Because most more developed agricultural produce is for selling, proximity to market is huge because, of course, if you're far from market, you're going to pay more in shipping costs to get it there. But conversely, you're going to pay less in land costs by being located far away from the central marketplace. Thus, von Thunen model steps in. And in this model, we look at distance to markets, and that determines what crop will be produced by farmers, or what's the ideal crop to produce given proximity to market and cost of land. Von Thunen's model is used to explain the importance of proximity to market, and there are two factors to consider. The cost of land. Okay, you've got to produce a product that yields enough profit that offsets the high cost of land closer to the market and the low cost of land further away. The other factor is the cost of transportation to market. This is part of distance decay or friction of distance. Products cost differently when transporting based on their weight and perishability. The farther you are from the market, the more transportation costs you're going to pay. The closer you are to market, the less transportation costs you're going to pay. But there are other factors, of course. Weight and perishability also must be considered by the farmer. Remember, farmers act to maximize profit. So this is what we call a cost to distance relationship. The higher the total labor costs, the closer the agricultural practice should be to the market. The lower the total labor costs, the farther it is from the market. So in this model, fruits, vegetables, and dairy are much more expensive by volume than wheat and other grains. And so the high price of these fruits and vegetables allows farmers to afford the more expensive rent closer to market. That's what a cost to distance relationship means in von Thunen's realm. Here we have a breakdown of von Thunen's. And on the right side, you probably haven't seen this, but this is what von Thunen's would look like if our central market is bisected by a river. That changes things. Here's the simplified version. In the middle, we've got the central marketplace. Then we have intensive or labor-intensive farming, mixed fruit, vegetable, flower, herbs, and also dairy. Then we have the village forest located closer to the center because of the weight of the timber. Then we have extensive farming like wheat, corn, soybeans, and then we have grazing lands all the way out. So we move from intensive, the most intensive farming, to the most extensive farming on the outside. Okay, so let's just break these down, break the concentric rings down. And right in the middle is the village or the central marketplace. And this is the place where agricultural products produced in the surrounding areas, aka the hinterlands, are consumed. So the population center is in the village market, but there are certainly people who live in the surrounding countryside. And in the concentric ring, just touching the central marketplace, we have labor-intensive crops, things like fruits, garden vegetables, herbs, and anything that requires constant tending or weeding. And we need these crops to be centrally located to ensure ripeness and freshness, but also these are labor-intensive products. So to pay for that regular labor, you're going to have to be able to charge a high price, and with fresh fruits and vegetables, you can. Also, animal products include dairy from cows and poultry, eggs. In the next concentric ring, so the second concentric ring outside of the central city, we have a managed forest. And this is needed to meet the energy and lumber needs of the community. And most people in the 1800s would have burned wood in their stoves to cook over and for other daily chores. So lumber would have been a daily necessity for most people. And due to its weight, trees are located close to the town to minimize the very expensive transportation costs. And we must view a managed forest as a renewable resource, because we're not cutting down all trees, we're selectively logging based on age and how far apart the trees are, to allow for the forest to grow and be sustainable. The next concentric ring beyond the forest are labor-extensive crops, crops that require far less tending as opposed to strawberries, which require daily weeding and attention. Crops like wheat, barley, and rye require little tending other than planting or harvesting. There's not much work to be done in between. As we discussed with the grain farming section of MDC agriculture, these are members of the grass family and therefore need a large plot of land to spread out. So you don't want to buy land close to the central market because land is limited. There's more competition for that centrally located land. It's going to cost more. Wheat, barley, rye, those are commodities and don't fetch high prices on the market. So again, we need wheat, barley, and rye, and oats and other grains in much larger volumes than fruits and vegetables, hence why they're important, but don't occupy a central location in von Thunen's concentric ring model. Let's look at the last concentric ring, grazing land. It's the least labor intensive. A single shepherd could tend well over 100 head of beef cattle or sheep or whatever domesticated animal is locally appropriate. In contrast, dairy cattle require constant milking and supervision. At least twice daily are dairy cattle milked. There's lots of land required for grazing of cattle in particular, but also pigs and chickens and sheep and goats. So again, you don't want to pay the high cost of land close to the market, so you move grazing land as far away from the market as possible in the outer concentric ring, and still the animals can walk themselves into market to be sold and slaughtered. Let's look at some limitations of the von Thunen model, because we know that it's a theory, it's a model, it's designed for a perfect world, but we don't live in a perfect world. So von Thunen's does not consider site or human factors. So let's provide an example. The topography of the land may not be conducive for planting. So there are certainly places that have the soil and the climate and the culture for planting, but the topography doesn't lend itself to planting. So instead, people raise domesticated animals or find sustenance from another means. It also doesn't consider social customs. So we have certain groups having taboos against eating pork. Judaism and Islam are religions that forbid the eating of pork and pork products. We can also look at Hinduism, strict Hinduism, forbidding the consumption of beef. But it doesn't have to be a religious custom. It can be based on local preference. Also, the von Thunen model doesn't look at governmental limitations. Governments may be too weak, for example, to keep out raiders and bandits, so villagers can't safely live outside of the city walls, and so therefore agriculture has to be confined within the city limits, and so that might change the dynamic of profitability, cost of land, and cost of transportation. We're going to assess for a few minutes the challenges for both commercial and subsistence farmers. And the thing that they both share is that commercial farmers and subsistence farmers, so farmers in MDCs and farmers in LDCs, all struggle to make a living. Profits are low because labor is very intensive, and there's simply a ceiling for agricultural products, the price that you can charge. But specifically to commercial farming, the production of large quantities of food causes low prices for those products. This is what we call overproduction. And because of mechanization and the Green Revolution and the second and third agricultural revolutions, we've become very efficient at producing food, large amounts of food. If we just look at the U.S. Dairy industry, in 1960 we had 20 million cows who were producing 63 million tons of milk per year. But in 2005 we've reduced that 20 million to just 9 million cows, but they're producing more milk at 90 million tons. So we're producing more with less than ever. But despite that high production, or some would say overproduction, we're seeing stagnant demand in MDCs due to stabilizing populations or even shrinking populations in places like Germany, Russia, Japan, and Singapore. This overproduction is also tied to U.S. government policies. Farmers are encouraged by the government to avoid producing crops that are in excess supply. The commodity crops of corn, wheat, and soybeans, for example, get a lot of government subsidies or payments to not farm or to farm as little as possible. And so these, pardon the bell. These government subsidies pay farmers when certain crop prices are low so that these commodity crop farmers can make a living. And let's do a comparison here. In 2005, there were $25 billion of government subsidies paid out to farmers. And in 2017, it's predicted that around $23.3 billion will be paid out in subsidies to farmers. But we're not talking about small, family-owned regional farms that are the beneficiaries of these government payments. We're talking about large industrial corporations, the corporations that control large market shares of the U.S. agricultural sector. So the sector of farming, the small family farm that's suffering most, is receiving no or very low benefits from the government, whereas the industrial agricultural corporations who are raking in profits are receiving most of the government benefits, which a lot of people in the agricultural community would cry foul. They would say that that's an unfair system of subsidizing agriculture. Also, the government is involved in buying surplus crops from large industrial producers and either giving that food to foreign governments where malnutrition is high, or just destroying them, because if those crops are sold on the market, then that's going to drive down the market price and therefore make it harder for farmers to see any profit for that year. So a question we'll discuss in class is, what hinders a more globalized economy in agriculture? What are the barriers to a more globalized and interconnected agricultural economy? Let's look at sustainable agriculture, because sustainable agriculture could be a possible solution to change commercial agriculture, particularly in the United States, to make it more long-term, to make it healthier for the environment, for the animals involved, and for the humans consuming and growing the products. Sustainable agricultural practices are those that preserve and even enhance the quality of the environment. Farms that use sustainable agricultural practices generally operate at lower costs, but there are also lower revenues. So this cuts both ways. Farmers have lower overhead, but generally they can't make as much money in the market. There are three distinguishing characteristics of sustainable agriculture. They are, number one, sensitive land management. Number two, limited use of chemicals. And three, better irrigation of crops and livestock. We're going to tackle each one of these successively. Sensitive land management first. Sensitive land management is getting the most out of a limited amount of arable land. And we're increasingly seeing ridge tillage, which is the planting of crops on ridges that are formed during cultivation or harvest. So for example, corn might be planted in the furrows or the troughs or the shallow bowls that come from the tilling, and the mounds that are pushed up by the plow are left unused. But well, now we're figuring out we can plant other crops on those ridges and maximize our planting land. And this lowers production costs due to less investment in machinery. Instead of multiple machines used on several fields, we have one machine needed, and that's going to allow more farmers to mechanize and become efficient, rather than just having the large industrial farms having access to machinery. And we also see greater soil conservation due to narrower channels between crops, and that decreases runoff and all other kinds of hazardous effects that come from industrial scale agriculture. The second aspect of sustainable agriculture is the limited use of chemicals. Modern commercial agriculture often relies on genetically modified seeds, and this is done so that less pesticides and chemical fertilizers are required to be sprayed directly onto the crops. So genetic modification can be a way to decrease the amount of chemicals that our environments, that our animals, that our consumers are exposed to. And we're also seeing some weeds that are becoming resistant, so we're having to find alternative ways to make sure that our crops are growing strong without being choked off by pests like weeds. So we have this combination of mechanical weed control along with a limited use of chemicals, which is a sustainable way forward in terms of how we approach growing food in a commercial economy. And lastly, we have integrated crop and livestock. We have irrigation. This is still about sensitive land management. Okay. Integrated crop and livestock farming. That's the growing crops and raising of livestock. And these practices are seen as complementary on the farm, not independent. But increasingly, we see confined domesticated animals. What sensitive land management promotes is limited confined livestock to increase free-range options and free-range products for consumers, where animals aren't caged or housed in large closed-off barns, but are having at least some time outside to range on their natural foods. Let's look at challenges for subsistence farmers. The choice of crops is greatly influenced by rapid population growth in LDCs. You've got to grow what you can grow easiest and fastest and produces the most amount of food to feed a exploding population. And to meet this growing demand, a lot of subsistence farmers are adopting what's called the international trade approach to development. And they're choosing crops that people don't eat locally, but rather that are sold on the global marketplace. So this means that subsistence farmers who have traditionally grown food to consume on the farm or in the village are now growing crops that they may not have a history of consuming, that aren't part of their diets, and that are going to be sold. So we still have the problem of malnutrition. So that's something that persists in less developed regions, despite farmers gaining more access to international markets. Population growth in LDCs influences crop choices, as I said. And somebody in the geography world who's written extensively about this is a woman named Esther Busserup. And basically her argument says that population growth compels or forces subsistence farmers to consider new farming approaches that produce enough food to take care of the additional people that we see through population growth. And to accomplish this, farmers must intensify production in some way. This is what's called Busserup's intensification stages. In stage 1, we see traditional shifting cultivation or slash and burn, where you have people who live in a forest environment. They slash and burn, use the burn debris for nutrients in the soil. They plant for 2 years and then allow the used field, the swidden, to regrow over a period of about 20 years. Fallow means that you're not planting anything, that the land is regenerating, that the soil is having its nutrients restored. Okay, so that's what we call forest fallow. Then we have bush fallow, where instead of just 2 years of use, we get 8 years of use out of a particular agricultural plot, and then 10 years of fallow. Then we have the short fallow, so you're seeing we're planting for longer and fallowing for shorter periods of time. This is the intensification that Busserup is referencing. So in short fallow, we have 2 years of use and just 2 years of fallow. In stage 4, we have annual cropping, where every year we use the same plot of land with just a few months out of the year allowing the soil to regenerate its nutrients. Then we have multi-cropping, where a plot is used several times per year and never left fallow. Obviously, that's going to use the soil in a much more intense way and productivity over a period of years will decline. But in LDCs, where populations are growing rapidly, sometimes farmers are forced to multi-crop because there's high competition for land and resources. Her second method of increasing intensification is through adopting new farming methods. And to adopt new farming methods, additional labor and emphasis is needed. Focus on the labor, okay? Labor supplies come from an increased population. So what is the problem? What is the inherent problem with Boserup's second way? Okay, so she says we need to focus on increasing our labor supply. So you really have two options to increase the labor supply, and we'll talk about it in class, how both of these aren't long-term solutions. Okay, let's look at overall strategies to increase our food supply. One is to expand the land area used for agriculture, but that might require pretty intense modification of the landscape. In 1950, human population began to outpace the expansion of agricultural land for really the first time in modern history. And this led to desertification, the causing of land to deteriorate to a desert-like condition. And desertification has been caused by overgrazing of domesticated animals and, of course, poor farming practices that don't look at the long-term health of the environment. And desertification not only leads to local climatic change, but it can lead to salinization of the soil, where hardly anything will grow because of the high salinity in the soil. And we'll look specifically at a case study of the Aral Sea and salinization of the soil there. Water distribution also has to do with the expansion of agricultural land. Okay, and so does urbanization, where our urban areas are growing faster than ever across the globe. And this rapid urbanization is putting pressure on the land to produce more food, but it's also taking arable farmland, because generally humans don't build cities in the middle of deserts unless you're Dubai. So urbanization is generally reducing arable farmland in most places. We can focus on increasing productivity to raise productivity and to build off of what happened during the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is often called the Third Agricultural Revolution, and it's the invention and rapid diffusion of more productive agricultural techniques during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. We're talking about the introduction of higher yield seeds and the expanded use of fertilizers, pesticides, and GMOs. Particularly the Green Revolution was beneficial, at least in the short term, for less developed regions. We're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, the Indian subcontinent, Central and South America. We can also identify new food sources. We can begin more intensively cultivating the oceans, although overfishing is certainly a downside, and we're starting to see stocks of commodity fish like tuna and salmon and mackerel and cod. Those stocks are already starting to dwindle, and that's going to have a chain reaction type effect on the health of the ocean. So that might not be the solution moving forward. It might be developing higher protein cereals. The vast majority of protein in less developed countries comes from wheat, corn, and rice. So if we can develop a cereal crop with higher protein yields in the range of quinoa or wheat germ, which have very high protein contents to carbohydrate, then that might be a sustainable way to provide protein for a hungry world. Or we can just look at improving the palatability of rarely consumed foods. Like we discussed in class, eating insects and other squirmies. And generally, Americans and consumers in the more developed regions should just stop being so dang picky and eat the food already. Our last slide here, just over 30 minutes. We're looking at strategies to increase food supply. Countries can always try to increase exports from other countries. Okay, so you can see that the United States is a net exporter. We send a lot of wheat in particular to other parts of the world. And generally, the countries that suffer from higher rates of malnutrition, okay, right here, they tend to be net importers. So they need to gain access to the global markets and start producing food for export, although this could have consequences if all countries are producing the same foods for export. If we have more diverse cropping rather than just wheat, corn, rice, soybeans, then that might be a sustainable way to increase our food supply. All right, guys, I'm going to encourage you to go ahead and click to end the office mix and to go ahead and do the quizzes practice assessment over this material. So I'll see you in class. Please let me know if you had questions in the course of this video lecture series. Thanks a lot. Bye, guys.